In the last lecture module, we looked at how someone might respond to the Euthyphro dilemma. That is, how one might attempt to diffuse specifically horn number 2. In this module, we're going to look at one last attempt to diffuse that horn, and then we're going to look at the implications for moral and ethical theory if horn 1 turns out to be the more desirable of the two choices. So as a result of the incoherence of omnipotence argument, philosophers of religion and theologians since the Middle Ages have supposed that God's power is limited by logic. The difficulty in the appeal that we looked at last time to God's omnipotence in order to diffuse the difficulties associated with horn 2 of the dilemma was precisely that it violates the rules of logic. It requires that God somehow create contradictory features of ethics or morality. Specifically, the goodness of an act is exclusively and exhaustively determined by the deity's will, while at the same time, the goodness of an act is completely independent of the deity's will. And these two things are contradictions, and hence they can't both be true at the same time. And if we accept the solution to the incoherence of omnipotence argument, it looks like it undermines the response or the attempt to respond to horn 2 of the Euthyphro dilemma. We might, however, still attempt to defend both God's omnipotence in that classical sense and divine command theory by claiming that these seeming difficulties, both with divine command theory and with God's omnipotence, are simply manifestations of humanity's finite and defective capacity to reason and to understand. That is, we're not capable of understanding why it is that these things are true, even though they appear to be contradictory. One sometimes hears this idea expressed in the popular slogan, "God moves in mysterious ways." Now, were we to present this defense to Plato, I would suggest that chances are Plato would respond something like this. Now, the difficulty with claiming that a deity's actions are beyond human understanding is that horn 2 is not incomprehensible. It simply offers what many find to be an inadequate explanation or answer for why we ought to follow the dictates of the deity. Specifically, it seems to violate what's called the principle of sufficient reason. The idea behind the principle of sufficient reason is pretty straightforward. When someone makes a choice, commands something, wills something, and so on, they do so because there's a reason that is sufficient for them to choose that commandment, that choice, that course of action over other possibilities. So actions have reasons that are sufficient to distinguish them from other potential courses of action. Choices have reasons. Commands have reasons. If the deity willed lying immoral, one expects that the deity has a reason for willing lying immoral, as opposed to willing lying moral. However, on the second horn, and to avoid the first horn, there can be no reasons, just the willing. Thus, many feel that the second horn undermines normativity by making morality look arbitrary and irrational. Up to this point in our lecture module, we've been focusing on the second horn of the Euthyphro dilemma. But what about that first horn? Well, if worries about divine command theory are legitimate, then it looks as though the deity's role must be that of moral reporter as opposed to moral commander. You might wonder, well, why would that matter, though? Intellectually, it suggests that one can be moral no matter what one's religious convictions. Even if one doesn't believe in a deity, one can still be moral. It doesn't mean that you have to be moral or that you will be moral. It means that you have the potential to be moral. Now, the idea that people are capable of apprehending moral truths and moral norms, they're capable of reasoning about moral truths and moral norms, and they're capable of adhering to moral norms, despite their religious convictions or lack thereof, may seem sort of pedestrian in our contemporary context. However, that idea was really a radical and fringe idea for most of European history up until, say, the Enlightenment. For example, this gentleman here on the bottom right, John Locke, is famous for having written a letter concerning religious toleration, in which Locke argues that we should be as tolerant as possible with regard to people's religious convictions. We shouldn't be dogmatic or intolerant towards people who differ in their religious views. He argues this right up until this sentence. Lastly, those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. So Locke, a British empiricist, a person who is living and writing and thinking during the Enlightenment, a man who has been described as one of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers and described as the father of liberalism, in the midst of one of his most famous liberal tracts, writes that we should not be tolerant of atheists, non-believers, presumably also agnostics, precisely for ethical reasons, because they're not capable of living ethical lives. Let's end this lecture module and this first lecture for the week by briefly recapitulating the material that we've covered in this first lecture. The core ideas of this first lecture center around two fundamental kinds of questions or problems that we would like to understand and have solutions for or theories about in our ethical reasoning and ethical actions. The first of these problems or questions has to do with the source of moral authority. We said that we would like an account of why it is that some actions are judged to be good or morally praiseworthy, while other actions are judged to be bad or morally blameworthy. And part of that account, we said, should help us to understand why it is that we feel obliged to conform to moral norms. This was the fundamental organizing question or problem for this first lecture. The second problem that we're going to address primarily in the second lecture has to do with the nature of moral knowledge. Specifically, we said we would like to understand and know how it is that we can get moral knowledge, what criterion we would have to satisfy in order to have moral knowledge, where we might go to get moral knowledge, what are the sources of moral knowledge. We discussed in some detail divine command theory. We saw that divine command theory is an attempt to offer an explanation or an account of the source of moral authority. We looked at some of the reasons why theorists might find divine command theory attractive, that is, features of the theory that might motivate someone to adopt the theory. Then we turned our attention to objections or difficulties, focusing primarily on the Euthyphro dilemma, the argument that we find in Plato's dialogue of that name that states that divine command theory is mired in this choice between undesirable alternatives.